15th, 2009. I'm Councilmember Helene Schneider. Roger Horton is out of town today, and with me is Mayor Bloom and Councilmember Falcone. And we have one item on today's agenda. I'm just going to turn it over to Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Interim Finance Director. And we're here to discuss a program called Proposition 1 Securitization Program being implemented by California Communities. And it relates to the state's proposed or their borrowing of local government revenues, property tax revenues this year as part of their balancing of their budget for 2010. So we want to just give you a little bit of background on Proposition 1A and what some of the protections are that it provides, and then get into what we're recommending by way of participating in a program being offered by California Communities. So just a little bit of historical perspective. Proposition 1A was passed in 2004 by the California voters, and it was designed to protect further raise by the state, and Joe, maybe you can focus that a little bit, but protect further raise by the state on local revenues. Whoa.
Keep going.
Okay. There you go. As you know, there have been 3 ERAF shifts. The first in 1992, then one in 2003, and the most recent one was actually in 2005 and 2006. And the annual impact, that I'm told, is about a $7.5 billion revenues lost to local governments. As part of an agreement between local governments and the governor, ERAF 3 was about basically $1.3 billion being shifted from local governments in 2 years. But as part of that deal, the governor was supporting Proposition 1A. Maybe you can show that next slide, please. And Proposition 1A, again, was designed to protect further raise or ERAF shifts of local revenues. So I just wanted to go through some highlights of what the protections are that are included in Proposition 1A. First, in sales and use tax rate and allocation method. It prohibits the state from reducing the local portion, which is called the Bradley-Burns portion of the state sales and use tax rate. But it also prohibits them from changing the method in which the sales and use taxes are distributed. Now, they can change how they're distributed if required by federal law or to participate in an interstate agreement such as payment of sales taxes for interstate sales. So they can change it if, again, required by federal law. And you might recall that back in 2004, there was what's called the triple flip under Proposition 57. It was what enabled the state essentially to issue the California Economic Recovery Bonds, which was secured by 0.25% of the sales taxes that was swapped from local governments for an equal amount of property taxes. It was sort of a reverse ERAF shift. Again, it was required but essentially to provide a dedicated revenue stream to issue those bonds. And the swap will continue, so we'll continue to get property taxes in lieu of sales taxes throughout the bond repayment term. And Prop 1A prohibits the state from extending that swap period beyond the repayment period. And as you know, we are currently getting a fair amount of money that's really sales taxes, but it's an amount that's paid to us through the property tax process. We're treating it as sales taxes, and so we are tracking it separately, but for all practical purposes for us, it's still sales tax revenues. And the allocation is actually based on how sales taxes are allocated rather than how property taxes are allocated. And then vehicle license fees, as you know, that we are currently getting basically a VLF swap when they lowered it from 2% to 0.65%. That swap is in the form of property taxes, and that is actually being paid in the same format and the same basis as property taxes. So this is a permanent reduction. But that 0.5% that we're still getting is protected under Article 11 of the California Constitution, and the state isn't allowed to reduce that unless they backfill that amount. Now, they can charge for administrative costs for DMV, and they still retain the power to change state law allocating VLF among cities and counties. And at this point, we're getting a very small amount of this VLF revenue. It's going down and down as the state increases their administrative charges and overhead to those revenues. So we're seeing a diminishing amount. And then property taxes. they are prohibited under Proposition 1A, the legislature from reducing the share of property tax revenues going to cities, counties, and special districts and shifting that to schools or any non-local governmental function. They can alter the allocation of property taxes among local governments within a county with a two-thirds approval in each house. So in other words, whatever percentage right now that cities and counties and special districts are receiving, let's say it's 60%, they can't change that percentage. They can change the allocation between those agencies, but not reduce it in favor of school districts, for example. Now they can, and we'll talk about this, of course, the legislator can suspend the property tax revenue protection provisions in Prop 1A, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And as you know, property tax revenues received by RDAs, redevelopment agencies, is not included in the protections. They felt like that the California Constitution already protected raids on redevelopment agency tax increment revenues, and as you know, they were able to change the law so that they can now do that. At least that's what they're trying to do this year. So the suspension of property tax protection. So beginning last year, the legislature is able to borrow not more than 8% of the total property tax revenues if three things are met, three criteria are met. The first, that the governor issues a proclamation of severe fiscal hardship, that the legislature enacts an urgency statute suspending Proposition 1A property tax protection with two-thirds vote of each house, and the legislature enacts a law providing for a full repayment of the borrowed funds plus interest within 3 years. And the legislature may not enact such a suspension more than twice in any 10-year period unless they repay the twice in any 10-year period, and may do so only if the state repays the VLF backfill gap loan, which they have done several years ago, as you know. And also they have to pay back any other borrowings they have made in that 10-year period. So they can borrow money only if they've repaid any previous borrowings within the 10-year period. And as you know, as part of the state's 2010 budget, they did include the emergency provisions of Proposition 1A, and they in fact will borrow 8% of the total property taxes collected and distributed to local governments in 2009. They will repay that in 3 years. That's June 2012, including interest, which has now been determined to be 2% per annum. And the amount for the city of Santa Barbara is $2.2 million. Statewide, it's estimated at just over $2 billion. The state budget bill also authorized what's called the securitization of the loans receivable or the amounts being borrowed. You might recall an entity called California Communities, which is a JPA sponsored by the League and the California State Association of Counties. And they are the ones that are ostensibly going to be sponsoring this program. There is still some legislation that's required. AB 67 was proposed but failed, but it was basically to allow California Communities to be the sole implementers of this program. But the idea is that they will issue bonds, and the proceeds of those bonds will be used to advance the borrowed funds to participating agencies. Some agencies are choosing not to participate in this program, but for those who do, they will provide an advance payment of those borrowed funds this year. And the state will actually be making the debt service payments to the bondholders on behalf of California Communities. So the state is making the payments to bondholders. So some of the key features of the program are, one, the participating agencies will receive 100% of the amount of property taxes being borrowed in two installments, 50% this coming January 15th, 2010, and the balance 50% on May 3rd, 2010. Now, this is different than what happened back a few years ago with the VLF backfill loan, the GAP loan. We also participated in a securitization program sponsored by California Communities. At that time, we got roughly 92% of our money, because the balance was to pay for the costs associated with issuing the debt. In this program, we will receive 100% of the monies. And so, as indicated in the second bullet, agencies will not incur any cost of issuance, and participating agencies will have no obligations on the bonds or credit exposure to the state. So once we get our money, if we participate in this program, we are basically free and clear, and we are no longer on the hook for anything else. So essentially, the next steps for us is that we would like to take this, are planning to take this to council next Tuesday, and it does require the council approves a resolution authorizing the sale of the city's loan receivable or the borrowings, and it does require approval to execute a purchase and sales agreement, which contains terms and conditions and other legal documents in order to participate. Staff is recommending participation in this program. We believe that there's still some uncertainty with the state and what's going to be happening as part of their attempts to balance their budget. They still have some outstanding structural problems. The projections for next year are anywhere from $7 to $10 billion deficit. So we are not convinced that even though they're required by California Constitution to repay that loan, that they won't extend the term of repayment or some other measure to avoid payment. So we're recommending that we participate, particularly since it is 100% of the amount we would be getting 3 years from now. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
The state has a little structural, that's one of the most understated statements, I think, in a long time. Ms. Falcone, do you have some questions?
Well, I know that the League still has a tremendous concern with respect to the implementing legislation that has not yet been passed in Sacramento because they are picking at each other in the most childish of ways. But I'm all in favor of this, have been since the budget was passed, as one of the only ways that we could make sure that we remain whole, if you will, although there is this provision in 1A, and we knew it when we passed it that they would be allowed to borrow, that they are in such trouble, nobody particularly has any confidence that they'll be able to pay it back now in 3 years or ever particularly. So in order to be able to remain whole, having the ability to securitize is important for us. However, as you alluded to sort of briefly, the state is up to mischief on a regular basis and will very likely figure out a way to not pay us back in 3 years, to not pay us 100%, to not pay us the interest, to not pay us on January 15th through whatever machinations they come up with, which, as we've seen over the last several years, can be quite creative, actually. They don't always pass the smell test, but they're at least being creative about things. In that, I'm not sure exactly what the state is going to come up with respect to the actual details of implementing this. I understand you're wanting to move this forward so we're right there and able to move when the January date comes around. That being said, I don't know that I have enough information about exactly how it's going to come down right now to feel comfortable moving forward. But I'll see if you have any comments to that.
Sure.
Mr. Samaria?
Madam Chair, Ms. Falcone, the expectation is that legislation will be passed, enabling legislation will be passed in time for California communities to issue the bonds sometime in November or December. I think it's more like December, so that the payments are able to be made by January and then May. Now, if for whatever reason the legislation isn't passed and they aren't able to issue the bonds, then essentially what happens is we're going to default back to where we get our repayment in 3 years from now. All the documents and all the paperwork basically just is destroyed, and all agencies are going to have to wait 3 years, hopefully, to get repayment on the loan receivable. Again, it's payable at 2%. So this is just, again, there's an assumption or expectation that legislation will be passed, and we're moving forward with this to participate in the program if it's approved by council. Again, that's our recommendation. If it does fall through, then we are back to just hoping we get our money back from the state.
So just so I understand what you're saying, if the legislation doesn't move forward the way we expect it should, any resolution that we pass next week will be moot at that point because it's not related to any piece of legislation.
That's correct.
Right. And just a follow-up question, what the alternative of us not moving forward here, as you said, is to expect that the state would pay us back with interest in 3 years. Whether or not that happens, we don't know. But in terms of our own cash flow, our reserves, the monies in our own accounts, how does that affect our day-to-day operations?
Madam Chair, that's a good question. It doesn't present for us a cash flow problem. $2.2 million, if you just think in the context of citywide, is not a major issue to the general fund where this would actually be coming from. It's not an inconsequential portion of its reserves, But, as you know, the reserves that we have them in all funds, all operating funds. So if we were to have a natural disaster and we needed the cash, we could tap into other sources across all funds. So for us, again, it's not a cash flow problem. We would basically set up a receivable, and that receivable basically would be still part of our reserves. It's still an asset. It just wouldn't be available to us for 3 years or more.
So in terms, just to follow through, when people, you're looking at our budget, monthly budget sheets and so forth, and there's this receivable there of $2.2 million in our reserve policies. It's there, but it's just not in our own account. It's just as a receivable. So
That's correct.
it's not like we're going to have, just to be clear, it's not like we're going to have to cut additional $2.2 million from our operating budget this year because of the hit.
That's correct.
Okay.
And the last thing I'll say on that is that the interest rate, assuming they pay us, and at some point, the interest rate of 2% is fairly competitive. If we were to go out and invest in some securities right now, a 3-year paper, we would be getting less than 2%, somewhere around 1.3 to 1.7%. So a 2% repayment isn't below what the current market is providing.
And on the flip side, the worst case scenario, 3 years go by, they figure out some way not to repay us. Then we're in a situation where we have to find where those funds, because it's no longer an asset anymore if they're claiming
That's
that
correct.
they don't have to. But that's 3 years from now. But we're assuming, which is something one should never do,
Yes.
but they'll actually pay us back. Okay. Any other questions, Mayor? Do you have any?
No, I think what we're weighing.
Mike.
I'm sorry. Thank you. What we're weighing then is the interest rate is good, so that's okay. And then the risk of non-payment by the state is really what we're kind of thinking about. And that, to me, it makes sense to go ahead with this. But it's also iffy. It really is. Well, I don't think they're going to fix it in the next couple of years. So that's my issue on it.
And I think non-payment is probably more remote than just a delay of payment.
Okay.
Again, from what I understand in talking to our financial advisors, that non-repayment, just absolute non-repayment, it would be can amount to basically them being in bankruptcy. They could, again, delay it, defer it for who knows how many years, but to not pay this kind of a debt that's protected by the California Constitution would be a significant step. It would affect their ratings from the bonding agencies and the like, and make it difficult for them to issue new bonds, short-term bonds in the future. So I think, again, it could be delayed. Non-payment, in my opinion, is unlikely.
But the recommendation you're moving forward is by securitizing it, that's no longer an issue for us
Right.
because we will get the money
That's
back.
correct. It takes
through
that
this
whole
process.
conversation, it makes that whole conversation moot.
Okay. Ms.
Okay,
Falcone?
Thank you.
Just as a footnote onto that, the process of designing the implementing legislation is a true game of cat and mouse up there. And the League is in a very, very strong position at this point to make sure that local revenues are protected into the future by holding the threat of blowing up the securitization opportunity at their feet, so that they move, and they move in ways that we at local governments want them to move, and that they lock themselves in some very dramatic sorts of ways. Now, I'm just concerned that if enough of the cities say, yes, we're going to go for this, that we're not helping the League in their bargaining position. But that being said, to be able to securitize this debt is, of course, the best thing for us.
Right.
If we can really get the 100% promise, if we can really get the with interest promise, and those are not necessarily set yet. So herein lies the risk. That's what we're weighing. And it's a matter of we're going forward hoping that it will turn out the way we want it to, however, understanding that they're slippery up there, and we need to allow for the most aggressive sorts of bargaining on our behalf as we can. So that's my only point.
Okay. No, I agree completely with that. And with the resolution that's being forwarded next week, include those parameters of what we, or is it more like a blank resolution saying whatever's passed, we're going to go for it? But because I agree with Ms. Falcone that there are some issues, pieces of it that we would definitely want to see if we want to move forward, but we don't know what the final product looks like.
Right.
Yeah, I think that the resolution is more generic. I think that if there are any changes to the terms and conditions of the program, like the interest rate, for example, or how much we will get, whether it's 100% or less, I think that if there are any changes to that, my suspicion is that the whole program will just fall through. And again, we'd be back to the default position, which is just waiting for our money.
Go ahead.
There is one more piece to that, which is not just to fall back into the empty space of waiting for 3 years. There is serious consideration at the state level with the combined group to actually bring additional litigation with regard to the borrowing of 1A and its repayment methodology in sort of at a fundamental level. Also, there's been some moves at the league, at the board. When I was in San Jose last month, a unanimous vote was taken to further close loopholes by way of initiative on the November 2010 ballot that will address RDA, that will address this borrowing. It'll address the pieces that we didn't get to address in 1A. You.
Well, and I appreciate you knowing the inner workings of what's going on in the league board. So, Mayor Bloom, did you have?
No, it's good.
Well, I'll entertain a direction or a motion or moving forward with this item unless there are any other questions.
Well, I'll go ahead and make the motion to go to follow staff's recommendation, hereby forwarding this on to council and just heeding very closely the various machinations that are happening in Sacramento.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. I think we all agree the best interest is to keep the city's finances whole, and
Yeah.
for what we know right now, this is the best option to date. So, but we'll keep an eye on it. All right. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay. Passes unanimously. Thank you very much. And I believe that's the only item on the agenda. So we are adjourned. Thank you.